The crystal spires of Aquarius Prime gleamed like frozen tears against the violet sky. Princess Celeste stood at the edge of the royal balcony, her silver gown flowing like liquid starlight in the evening breeze. Tomorrow would mark her coronation as heir to the Aquarian throne, yet tonight felt more like a funeral than a celebration. She had always known her path would be different, born with eyes that shifted color like nebulae, and a mind that questioned. Every tradition, Celeste had never fit the mold of a perfect princess. While her sisters practiced courtly dances and diplomatic smiles, she studied ancient texts and dreamed of exploring distant worlds beyond their empire's reach. The whispers had started months ago. Hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Servants who avoided her gaze. Council members who spoke in riddles about the future of their people. Celeste felt the web of betrayal tightening around her like invisible chains, but she had hoped her family's love would protect her from the worst of it. She was wrong. The poison came disguised as ceremonial wine during the pre-coronation feast. As dignitaries from across the galaxy raised their glasses in her honor, Celeste felt the first burn of treachery sliding down her throat. The world tilted sideways, colors bleeding together like watercolors in the rain. Through her fading vision, she saw her Uncle Valdres step forward, his face a mask of false concern. "The princess has taken ill," he announced to the horrified crowd. "We must postpone the ceremony until she recovers." But Celeste knew she would never recover from this. Not here. Not among people who had traded her life for political convenience. When consciousness returned, she found herself locked in the cargo hold of a transport ship, her royal garments replaced by rough prisoner's clothing. The walls hummed with the energy of hyperspace travel, carrying her further from everything she had ever known. A holographic message flickered to life in the corner of her cell, showing Valdres seated on what should have been her throne. "My dear niece," his voice echoed, through the metal chamber. "Your radical ideas about peace with the human colonies have made you a liability to our empire. The council has voted unanimously for your exile. You will be taken to Chrysos, where you can contemplate the consequences of your dangerous thinking." Chrysos. Even the name sent ice through her veins. A forgotten world on the outer rim, where winter never ended and hope went to die. Political prisoners and war criminals were sent there to disappear. Their names erased from history, like words written in Snowdot. The ship shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, and Celeste pressed her face against the small porthole to see her new home. Chrysos stretched below like a wound in space, all gray mountains and frozen seas under a pale, dying sun. No cities dotted its surface, no lights pierced the eternal twilight. Just endless white emptiness that seemed to mock very idea of survival. They dumped her at the edge of a crashed transport, its hull already being claimed by ice and wind. The pilot who had brought her here was a cold-eyed Valdorian who spoke only to tell her that no rescue would come. The Empire had already announced her death from a sudden illness, he explained with cruel satisfaction. As far as the galaxy knew, Princess Celeste had died peacefully in her sleep, mourned by all who loved her, but she was very much alive, alone on a world that wanted nothing more than to claim her bones. The first night nearly killed her. Without proper shelter or supplies, Celeste huddled inside the broken transport as wind howled through the gaps in its hull like the voices of the damned. Her breath came in white puffs that froze on her lips, and every muscle in her body screamed against the cold. She had grown up in palaces where the temperature was always perfect, where servants anticipated her every need before she knew she had them. Here, she had nothing but her will to live. She tore strips from her prison clothes to wrap around her hands, trying to keep her fingers from freezing completely. Outside, something howled in the distance, and she realized that Chrysos was not as empty as it appeared. Predators roamed these wastes, drawn by the scent of weakness and despair, by the second day. Celeste was hallucinating from hunger and cold. She stumbled through knee-deep snow, following what might have been a path, or might have been a trick of the light. Her lips had turned blue, and she could no longer feel her feet inside her inadequate boots. The rational part of her mind whispered that she should stop, that rest would bring peace, that freezing was supposed to be a gentle way to die. But something deeper than reason drove her forward. Perhaps it was rage at the betrayal, or the stubborn pride that had always marked her as different from her family. She refused to give them the satisfaction of her easy death. If they wanted Princess Celeste of Aquarius gone forever, they would have to wait a little longer. It was then, as she crested a small hill and saw nothing but more endless white ahead, that she spotted the smoke, a thin gray line rising from behind a cluster of ice-covered rocks, barely visible against the colorless sky. It could be another trap, another cruel joke played by this hostile world. But smoke meant fire, and fire meant life, and right now, life was all she cared about. She half ran, half fell toward the source, her body moving on pure instinct now. The rocks formed a natural shelter from the worst of the wind, and tucked into their embrace sat a small prefabricated building that looked like it had seen better decades. Military green paint peeled from its walls, and patched metal sheets covered holes that spoke of hard-won survival. But light glowed through its windows, and the smoke rising from its chimney promised warmth beyond anything she had felt in days. Celeste collapsed against the door, her numb fingers barely able to form a fist to knock. The sound echoed inside like thunder, followed by the scrape of a chair and heavy footsteps. She held her breath, wondering if she was about to meet another exile, or something worse. The door opened, revealing a man who looked like he had been carved from the same harsh stone as this world. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by premature gray and eyes the color of deep water. Scars crossed his weathered face like a map of old battles, and his clothes were practical layers, designed for survival rather than style. But it was his expression that stopped her heart. Not suspicion or cruelty, but simple human concern. He took one look at her blue lips and shaking hands, and without a word stepped aside to let her in. "Easy," he said in a voice roughened by too many cold mornings. "You look half frozen. Come on, let's get you warm before we worry about anything else." Inside, the shelter was sparse but clean. A small fusion heater glowed in the corner, and the smell of cooking food made Celeste's empty stomach clench with longing. The man guided her to a chair near the heater and began pulling blankets from a storage locker, wrapping them around her. With practiced efficiency. "Name's Jackson Rivers," he said as he worked, "and you're a long way from anywhere friendly. What brings you to this frozen piece of hell?" Celeste tried to answer, but her throat was too raw from cold and thirst to form words. Jackson noticed her struggle and pressed a warm cup into her hands, steam rising from whatever was inside. She sipped carefully, feeling liquid heat spread through her chest like liquid sunlight. "Take your time," Jackson said, settling into a chair across from her. "I've got nowhere else to be, and neither do you by the look of things. This world has a way of stripping everything down to what matters. Right now, what matters is getting you healthy enough to tell me your story." As feeling slowly returned to her fingers and toes, Celeste studied the man who had saved her life. There was something about him that reminded her of the old knights in her childhood stories, honorable men who helped others simply because it was right. In a galaxy where everyone wanted something from her, his kindness felt like a miracle. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside this small shelter, warmth and safety seemed possible again. She did not know yet that she had just met the man who would change everything, who would teach her that love could grow, even in the harshest soil. All she knew was that for the first time since leaving Aquarius Prime, She was not alone, Dot, and sometimes that was enough to save a life. The days that followed blurred together like watercolors in rain. Celeste slept for nearly 18 hours after Jackson found her, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion and the promise of safety. When she woke, wrapped in warm blankets with the fusion heater humming nearby, she found a bowl of thick stew waiting beside her makeshift bed. Jackson sat at a small table across the room, carefully cleaning what looked like a military-grade plasma rifle. He glanced up when she stirred, offering a slight smile that transformed his weathered features. "Feeling more human?" he asked, then caught himself. "Sorry, old habit. Feeling better?" For the first time in days, Celeste managed a genuine laugh. "More human sounds about right, actually. I haven't felt much like myself lately." As her strength returned over the following days, she began to learn about the man who had saved her. Jackson Rivers had been a captain in the Terran Colonial Defense Force, stationed on frontier worlds to protect human settlements from raiders and hostile wildlife. He had come to Chrysos 3 years ago, not as an exile, but as a volunteer for the most dangerous assignment the military could offer. "Someone has to monitor the weather patterns and geological activity," he explained while teaching her to operate the shelter's basic systems. "Chrysos sits on some unstable fault lines. When they shift, they can trigger ice quakes that affect shipping lanes 3 systems over. It's lonely work, but someone has to do it." What he didn't say, but what Celeste gradually pieced together, from small comments and meaningful silences, was that he was running from something too. Not political betrayal like her, but the kind of ghosts that followed soldiers home from wars that never truly ended. Sometimes she caught him staring into the fire with eyes that saw battles she couldn't imagine, his hands unconsciously moving to scars that told stories he wasn't ready to share. The shelter that had seemed so small when she first stumbled through, its door revealed itself to be cleverly designed for survival. Solar collectors disguised as ice formations powered the fusion heater. Water recyclers turned snow and ice into something drinkable. Food synthesizers stretched basic protein packets into meals that almost tasted like real cooking. Everything had been planned and maintained with the precision of someone who understood that on Chrysos, mistakes meant death. "You built all this yourself?" Celeste asked one morning as Jackson adjusted the communication array that kept him in contact with the outside galaxy. "Modified it," he corrected. "The basic structure was already here when I arrived. Some previous occupant left behind a decent foundation. I just made it livable for the long term." She noticed he never mentioned trying to leave, never spoke of rotation schedules or end dates for his assignment. This was not a temporary posting for him. This was home, chosen freely, but chosen permanently. As the weeks passed, Celeste found herself adapting to their routine with surprising ease. She learned to check the weather sensors each morning, to maintain the solar collectors, to prepare meals from their limited supplies. Her soft princess hands grew calloused from repair work and manual labor, but she felt stronger than she had in years. More importantly, she felt useful. In the palace, her every need had been anticipated by armies of servants. Here, her contributions mattered. When she successfully repaired a malfunctioning water recycler, Jackson's proud smile warmed her more than any royal commendation ever had. They talked during the long evenings when wind howled outside their shelter. Not about politics or the grand affairs of empires, but about small things. Jackson told her about growing up on a farming colony where the sky was always blue and crops grew in neat rows toward the horizon. Celeste shared memories of her mother, who had died when she was young, and the secret garden where she used to hide from court tutors to read forbidden books about other worlds. What were the books about? Jackson asked one night as they sat by the fire sharing a pot of synthetic tea. "Everything my family thought was dangerous," Celeste replied. "Philosophy that questioned authority. History that showed how empires had fallen before. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things because it was right, not because they were ordered to. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. Sounds like your family was right to be worried. Ideas like that can change the world. Is that such a terrible thing? He met her eyes across the flickering firelight. Depends on who's in charge of the changing. It was during their 4th week together that the first real storm hit. Chrysos was known for weather that could kill the unprepared, but this was something beyond normal seasonal patterns. The wind screamed like a living thing, rattling their shelter until Celeste was certain it would be torn apart. Ice formed on the inside of the windows despite their heating, and the power fluctuated as snow piled higher than their solar collectors. Jackson worked frantically to keep their systems online, while Celeste helped however she could, following his terse instructions to reroute power and secure loose equipment. When a microfracture appeared in one of the main support beams, they had to work together to brace it with spare metal. Their bodies pressed close in the cramped space as they welded the repair in place. It was then, with the storm raging around them and their survival dependent on perfect cooperation, that Celeste truly understood what Jackson had given her. Not just shelter from the cold, but partnership in the deepest sense. They were no longer a princess and a soldier, an alien and a human. They were simply two people keeping each other alive against impossible odds. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally passed, they emerged from their shelter to find a world transformed. Snow had drifted higher than their heads in some places, completely reshaping the landscape. Their communication array had been damaged, leaving them truly isolated from the rest of the galaxy. How long before someone comes to check on you? Celeste asked as they surveyed the damage. Jackson's expression was grim. Next scheduled supply drop isn't for 2 months. We're on our own until then. Instead of fear, Celeste felt something unexpected. Relief. The outside galaxy had brought her nothing but betrayal and pain. Here, with Jackson, she had found something precious and fragile. She wasn't ready for the real world to intrude on what they were building together. That night, as they worked to repair their damaged equipment, Jackson paused in his task to look at her. Really look at her, as if seeing her for the first time. You know, he said quietly, when I first came to Chrysos, I thought I was choosing exile. Punishment for things I couldn't fix. People I couldn't save. But watching you these past weeks, seeing how you've adapted and grown stronger, I'm starting to think maybe exile chose us both for a reason. Celeste set down her tools and moved closer to him. In the soft light of their shelter, with ice crystals forming patterns on the windows, like nature's own artwork, she saw not the weathered soldier who had saved her life, but the gentle man who had given her something to live for. What reason? She whispered instead of answering with words. He reached up to touch her face, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her cheek. She leaned into his touch, feeling walls she hadn't even known she was building finally come down. When he kissed her, it was gentle and tentative, a question rather than a demand. She answered by wrapping her arms around him, pulling him closer, until there was no space left between them. Outside, the wind picked up again, but inside their small shelter, they had found something that could weather any storm. They didn't speak of love that night, but they didn't need to. Love was in the way Jackson held her, like she was precious beyond words, in the way Celeste trusted him with vulnerabilities she had never shown anyone. Love was in their quiet laughter and whispered conversations that lasted until dawn painted the sky in shades of hope. When morning came, they woke tangled together on the narrow cot, and Celeste realized that for the first time since leaving Aquarius Prime, she wasn't dreaming of revenge or justice or reclaiming her throne. She was dreaming of tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the tomorrows that might be possible with the man sleeping peacefully beside her. The rescue ship arrived on a morning when the aurora danced green and gold across Chryso's pale sky. Celeste and Jackson had been tracking its approach on their repaired sensors for hours, watching the steady blip that meant their isolation was about to end. 6 months had passed since that first storm brought them together in every sense. 6 months of shared meals and quiet conversations, of working side by side to maintain their little world, of falling asleep each night secure in each other's arms. They had built something beautiful and fragile in the ice and stone of an unforgiving world, and now that sanctuary was about to be tested. The ship that landed outside their shelter bore the markings of the Terran Colonial Defense Force, Jackson's former comrades, come to check on their missing weather station operator. Celeste watched through the window as figures in environmental suits approached, and her stomach twisted with familiar anxiety. "It'll be okay," Jackson said, taking her hand. "I won't let them hurt you." But as they prepared to face the outside galaxy again, both of them knew that promises and good intentions might not be enough. The universe they had left behind was still full of people who saw them as valuable pieces in larger games, and love was rarely considered a valid excuse for disrupting political plans. Commander Torres, the officer leading the rescue team, was a sharp-eyed woman who had served with Jackson during the Outer Rim campaigns. She looked between him and Celeste with an expression that mixed relief and suspicion. "Captain Rivers," she said formally, "we lost contact with your station 12 weeks ago." Command was beginning to assume the worst. Equipment failures after the big storm, Jackson replied, his voice carefully neutral. "We managed to get partial communications restored, but not enough for regular check-ins." Torres nodded, but her attention had shifted to Celeste. "And you are?" This was the moment Celeste had been dreading. Once she identified herself, word would spread through military channels and eventually reach ears that would recognize the supposedly dead Princess of Aquarius. Her uncle Valdris would learn that his inconvenient niece had not only survived, but had been living under the protection of a human soldier. "She's with me," Jackson said before Celeste could speak. "A refugee I found during the storm. She's been helping maintain the station." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Torres clearly sensed there was more to the story, but protocol required her to accept Jackson's explanation unless she had evidence to the contrary. "Well, refugee or not, she can't stay here," Torres said briskly. "New orders came through last month. The weather station is being automated and relocated to orbit. You're being reassigned to active duty, Captain. Pack whatever you need. We leave in 4 hours." Celeste felt the bottom drop out of her world. 4 hours to say goodbye to the only happiness she had ever known. 4 hours before she was thrust back into a galaxy that wanted her dead or disappeared. But Jackson surprised her. Instead of acknowledging his orders, he stood straighter and looked Torres directly in the eye. "I resign my commission," he said quietly. "What?" Torres stared at him like he had announced his intention to sprout wings. "Jocks, you can't be serious. Your career military. This place, this isolation, it's affected your judgment." "My judgment is fine," Jackson replied calmly. "I'm choosing to stay here with her. I'm choosing love over duty for once in my life." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Celeste felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. He was giving up everything he had been, everything he had worked for, to stay with her. "And what about you, miss?" Torres asked, turning to Celeste. "Are you really willing to spend your life on this frozen rock with a man who's throwing away his career?" Celeste stepped closer to Jackson, taking his hand in both of hers. "Commander, I've lived in palaces and walked in gardens that were the envy of 100 worlds. None of it was worth a fraction of what I've found here. If he's willing to stay, then yes." I choose him over everything else." Torres looked between them with an expression that mixed exasperation and something that might have been envy. "You're both certifiably insane," she said finally. "But I suppose love makes idiots of us all, eventually." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Captain, in all the years I've known you, I've never seen you look happy. Take care of each other." After the rescue team departed, Celeste and Jackson stood outside their shelter, watching the ship disappear into Chrysos' pale sky. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the eternal wind singing through the ice formations around them. "Do you regret it?" Celeste asked softly. Jackson turned to her with a smile that contained all the warmth missing from this frozen world. "The only thing I regret is not finding you sooner." They spent the next months transforming their survival shelter into something that looked more like a home. Using supplies from the abandoned automated equipment, Jackson expanded their living space and improved their life support systems. Celeste used skills she had learned in palace gardens to create a small greenhouse where they could grow fresh food. It was while working in that greenhouse, tending to the first green shoots they had coaxed from Chrysos' stubborn soil, that Celeste felt the stirring of new life within her own body. When she shared the news with Jackson, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around their small living space, laughing with pure joy. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "A child born of two worlds, two peoples who were never supposed to meet." Their daughter arrived with the spring thaw, if the slight warming of Chrysos' eternal winter could be called spring. They named her Nova, for the bright star that had guided lost travelers home, and she was perfect in every way that mattered. Half human, half Aquarian, with her mother's shifting eyes and her father's stubborn chin. Word of their unusual family eventually reached the broader galaxy, as word always does. Traders and explorers who stopped for supplies carried stories of the human soldier and alien princess who had chosen love over empire, who were raising their child in willing exile on one of the harshest worlds known to civilization. Some called it romantic, others called it foolish. A few called it dangerous, worried about the precedent it might set for other cross-species relationships in a galaxy still struggling with old prejudices. Celeste didn't care what they called it. When she looked at Jackson teaching their daughter to repair solar collectors, when she saw Nova's eyes light up with curiosity about the world around her, when she fell asleep each night surrounded by the warmth of her chosen family, she knew they had built something worth more than any throne. Years passed. Nova grew from a curious toddler to a bright child who spoke both Aquarian and Terran with equal fluency, who could survive in conditions that would challenge trained soldiers who looked at the stars not as distant lights, but as homes waiting to be explored. On her 7th birthday, as they celebrated with a cake made from greenhouse-grown ingredients and presents fashioned from salvaged materials, Nova asked the question Celeste had been dreading. "Mama, why did you and Papa choose to live here instead of somewhere with other people?" Celeste exchanged glances with Jackson, seeing understanding pass between them. Their daughter was old enough now to hear the truth, or at least the parts of it she could understand. "Because sometimes," Celeste said carefully, "the most important choice you can make is to stay with the people who love you exactly as you are. Your Papa and I found each other when we both needed someone to remind us that we are worth saving. We chose to build our life together rather than apart, even if it meant living differently than other families." Nova considered this with the serious expression she wore when thinking through complex problems. "But weren't you lonely before you found each other?" "Very lonely," Jackson said, pulling both his girls close. "But loneliness taught us to recognize love when we found it. And love, real love, is worth any sacrifice." As their daughter nodded and returned to playing with her handmade toys, Celeste leaned against Jackson's shoulder and watched the aurora dance across the evening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all tomorrows did. But tonight, surrounded by love in a shelter they had built with their own hands, she was exactly where she belonged. The exiled princess had become something better than royalty. She had become herself, completely and without apology. And in a galaxy full of people playing roles assigned by others, that was the most revolutionary thing of all.